lunchtime talks. For all of the students that are in the room, we do keep an attendance, and as you probably know, if you attend 6 of our lunchtime talks, you'll receive a certificate. If you attend 10 or more of our lunchtime talks, you'll get a higher certificate. And we also have a book draw after every lunchtime talk, so you are entered into that book prize as well. This afternoon we have a very interesting presentation from Peter Constantinou, who is one of our faculty members in the School of Public Policy and Administration, who has a really interesting background and career. As some of you probably know, he served in the Ontario Public Service for a period of time. And he's done a number of other interesting things. He's a great exponent of experiential education, something that I believe very strongly in as well. And he's been looking at high-intensity learning experiences. And as you know, he is one of the people that's managed to climb Mount Kilimanjaro, which is the highest mountain, of course, in Africa. It's something like 5,895 meters. It's in Kilimanjaro National Park. I think the term in the African language in terms of Kilimanjaro means mountain of greatness. So it's the largest mountain clearly visible within Africa, as I'm sure many of you know. Only 61% of the people that attempt to climb Mount Kilimanjaro actually succeed in doing so. 77% of the people suffer acute mountain sickness in the effort to do it. And a number of people die as a result of their effort to climb the mountain. And the latest statistic that I've found is that 13.6 per 100,000 climbers actually die. So there is a real risk and danger of attempting to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. So Peter, we're really interested in hearing what you have to say about your experience climbing the mountain and what it actually taught you about teaching and learning. Hopefully it's not a dangerous profession.
All right. Thank you very much, James, for that introduction and for the work you do in supporting these lunch talks. I also want to thank Ian Green, who's here, because when I was a student of his, he talked about hiking in the Himalayas. And the first thing I did when I graduated from our program here is go to hike the Annapurna circuit around Mount Everest. And so this was the beginning of a lifelong interest in hiking and trekking. And so what I wanted to share with you today is that really neat experience of climbing a mountain, but also the takeaways for me that I think are inherent there. A lot of what I want to do is share some images and pictures with you as a way of better conveying part of this journey. And if everyone's okay, let's keep it very informal. If there are any questions along the way, I'll take you through first the experience of getting up to the top and back, and then sort of what it all meant for me. Picture this. I am a 6-year-old kid. I'm sitting there reading the politics section of the newspaper, mustache, and I see on TV this image. Now that is my first recollection of the outside world. I remember seeing this, and a couple of things struck me. First, as you're a kid, you're always excited about animals, and Africa has that great allure, the big game, and all of the culture and history. But in the middle of this savanna desert is this ice-capped mountain, and it is the tallest freestanding mountain in the world. Most of the other big mountains are all part of a mountain range. They're attached to other ones. This one just sits there in the middle of the savanna, and so it had, for me, a big impact. Part of it was, as a kid, I couldn't reconcile how hot Africa had snow. And for a lot of the history of the first exploration of Mount Kilimanjaro, there was this legend, how could there be snow in Africa? The image has been portrayed in many ways in film, and the minute I saw it, that was it, and I wanted to see it. I didn't have ever in my mind growing up that I could ever climb it. Climbing was something other people did. No idea what climbing meant, but I wanted to see that. In the meantime, I watched everything I could watch, and as a kid, Tarzan was a big part of that, and I would watch, and I remember the fun I would have, and it was for me kind of an escape to go to this really exotic place, a place where so many people wondered about, but very few had been. And throughout my life, whether it was the comedic side of Africa or whether it was the more serious side, this was a part of my growing up. And then the Ernest Hemingway book, The Snows of Kilimanjaro, that took this sort of to a more serious level. And so for a long time, this was something I was greatly interested in. And then after a while, into my sort of early 20s, I found out that you could climb. I didn't know people could climb this mountain. And so I started to do some reading. And in particular, there's a fella here who spent his career as an accountant with the government of Canada, and he retired, and he and his son went out on a trek to climb Kilimanjaro, and he wrote this really wonderful book with him about that experience. And then I got a guidebook that actually talked about the how-to and all of the tips that were necessary, and I was determined at some point I was going to do this thing. Now, I had never been to sub-Saharan Africa. We had spent some time as a family visiting this part of the world. We got into Egypt, but never all the way down here. And in many ways, between Kenya and Tanzania, this has been the focus for a lot of the tourism and ecotourism and safaris that have been available, with some very well-developed game parks that are well-suited for visitors. And Tanzania sits right there with Mount Kilimanjaro, just near the border with Kenya. I didn't realize how important it was. It is one of the 7 summits that all of the mountaineers want to do, the highest mountain on each of the continents. And so you get a sense here for how very high it is. But the fact that it is freestanding makes that impression more impactful. It just sits there in the middle of nothing. The biggest problem with this is altitude. Everyone says hiking Kilimanjaro is not a difficult thing except for the height. So the biggest fear in altitude sickness is a kind of problem known as cerebral hemorrhage, where your brain starts to swell, or pulmonary edema, where you start to get fluid in the lungs. We can't control for this, so there is a medication that all hikers climbing will take. But after that, it really is up to your metabolism. We saw people who were 100 pounds overweight. They would walk to the top and back, and they were fine. And others were marathon runners, top physical form. They couldn't get halfway without having to turn around. So it is not so much about your fitness as it is about your body's capacity to deal with less oxygen. And when you get closer to the top, there is only half the amount of oxygen there is at sea level. And so for many people, this is a major struggle, and something that we have on our mind all the time. A big part of this trip was for me to fulfill a childhood dream, but also the opportunity to do this with my daughter is a very special thing that we could always share. But in the back of my mind was always, what if we go all the way over there and we spend all that money and that effort? We've told everybody we're going, and we get there and we can't climb. What about that? And so for me, a lot of this is about going to university. You are not sure. Can I do it? Do I have what it takes? Is it going to be too hard? Will there be the kinds of supports I need? And what if I don't make it? So a lot of this is kind of moving out of your comfort zone and doing things where you have the prospect of failure. So that's us. My daughter's a 22-year-old graduate student at the University of British Columbia. And this, take close note, this is before the trip, because we're ready to go. We're getting our gear together, and this is the last shower I've had for quite a while. So we were lucky enough in our group to have a mom and her daughter. So there were only 4 of us in the expedition. Now, the week before, they had a group of 25. The week after, they had 18 scheduled. But that one week, there were just 4 of us. And as it turned out, we hit it off. This was really a wonderful combination of people and personalities. The 2 daughters were virtually identical in age, and we just we just had lots in common. They were from Pennsylvania, we were from Ontario, and so we could complain about the weather, and there were lots to bring us together. And this is what we carried. So the beauty of the expeditions that are led on the mountain, the porters will carry all of the equipment. So the tents and the food and the chairs and everything. Whereas all you're carrying on a daily basis is just an extra layer of clothing, perhaps a set of gloves, and 2 or 3 or 4 liters of water, because that's the target for your consumption each and every day. So here we are getting ready to go. You all have to go in the same gate, and what the game wardens and park wardens do is they make sure that no porter is carrying a load more than 45 pounds. Now, I put one of those bags on my head to see what it was like, and immediately my spine compressed and I thought I was going to die. But they walk the entire time up and down with this package on their heads. And so they inspect each of those bags to make sure, and they're weighed to ensure that no one is carrying more. And so you see on occasion someone pulls out a sock or a bottle or something just to kind of get the weight right, because they all tend to work right at the maximum. And the nice thing was we had this wonderful group that was very organized and highly regarded, and there were other tour companies that were cheaper but didn't have the same caliber of or quality of porters, and I was really impressed from the very beginning. And that's the truck they needed just to carry our stuff to the base of the mountain, where then the porters would take it from there. That's what we slept in. So 2 people per tent. They set it up each day, and all we had to do was get ourselves there. I can tell you that each day we would have dinner around 6:30, and we would be in bed by 8, exhausted and just ready to sleep. That's the toilet, and that was probably among the harder things for me. It was not a pretty sight. Part of this was, again, outside of the comfort zone. You are in the middle of the jungle, and there is nothing else there. And it took 2 days for us to walk to get to see the mountain. So imagine, as we're walking after the first day, I turned to them and I said, maybe this is a big scam. There really is no mountain here. They just tell people there's a mountain. But finally, lo and behold, we saw it. And what makes it remarkable is it was a volcano. There are 3 craters there, one that has collapsed and has sort of become a plateau, but a volcano that has not erupted in over between 150 and 200 million years. But one of them is still considered to be active, although there is no activity on the surface. And so it is so very big and stands out in the middle of nowhere. So here we are, we're ready to go. That's the first time we saw the mountain. And what happens very quickly is how cold it starts to get, especially at night. So even in the savannah, where you're in the jungle, at night it goes below 0. And in the middle of the night when you have to go pee and you take that zipper on the tent, and you can hear the frost kind of chipping away, and boy, is it cold. One of the things I was really impressed with was the professionalism of the guides. The first day we sat down with them, the first thing out of their mouth was, our priority is safety. Period. So there will be a medical test every night and every morning to determine whether you're safe to continue. And that introduced some excitement, but also some fear in us, because what if we weren't cleared to hike? What if they heard something in our lungs? Or what if the oximeter they used to measure how much oxygen was being absorbed by the blood, what if that wasn't? What if we couldn't make it? And so a guide would walk at the front, a guide at the back, and a fellow at the back there carried oxygen and a hyperbolic chamber that would be used for cases of acute mountain sickness at the very highest level. The challenge here is that helicopters can't fly to the top, so they have to find ways of dealing with when things go wrong. So in severe cases, you go in here, and the only real solution is to get you down. So you see often as you're walking, people carrying people on stretchers down, because every foot lower is easier on your body. And so there's often that mad race to get people to safety. They treated us like kings, 24 people carrying all that equipment, and every day there was snacks and great food. The interesting thing about all of this was they said, stop thinking about food as something you enjoy eating. Think about food as fuel. We're going to alter what you eat to meet the challenge of the day ahead. And so there are times where they were heavy on carbohydrates and other times when there were different choices of food depending on the length of the hike and the temperature. So that's us in our tent, and it was one of those really great bonding exercises where the two of us could really, at the end of the day, kind of share our experiences. Every morning they brought hot tea to the tent to kind of give us a chance to wake up. And I got to tell you, the first couple of nights I couldn't sleep because I was afraid. I was worried. What if I can't get up? What if I can't? What if I have to go back? What if I can't go back? I can't go up, but my daughter can go up. What if she can't go up? And this is sort of racing. And your heart is working, and your lungs are working a lot harder because, of course, there's less oxygen. So you are not in your normal state, and it made sleeping difficult. These were our porters. Every morning they would sing to us, and by the end of the trip, boy, we knew every word of every song. It was a methodical thing, and it reminded me again of those movies I saw when people were carrying boxes as part of the safari, and they would sing. Now, there are 4 or 5 ecosystems, depending on what you think. I find it interesting that they talk about civilization as the bottom, but the idea is the further up you go, the weather and the conditions change. And so you start in a savanna, you work your way into a rainforest, and then the higher you go, moorland, where you see less and less vegetation, an alpine desert, and then an ice cap where there is a frozen glacier. And so here we are, the hot savanna, the kind of image of Africa we all think of, and it is over 100 degrees during the day. This was in August, a time of the year when it is hot. And then you start to move into a rainforest where the air is so thick and lush that everything can grow almost anywhere, moss and a mold and a fungus, because of how much moisture there is in the air. Full of all kinds of monkeys. These are colobus monkeys, mischievous little devils. If you put your sandwich down, you're going to lose it. And all kinds of wonderful birds that make really interesting noises. And this fella, I had never seen anything like this, a blue monkey. Their fur is blue, and they sneak into camp and take things that they really shouldn't. And so we all had to be on the lookout for the blue monkeys. Then we move into the moorland, and you can see how there's less vegetation, less green, more scrubbery. But the beauty, even in this harsher terrain, is quite visible. Lots of very hardy and attractive flora. And then we start to get into the alpine desert, where very little grows because of how cold and how much less rain there is. A lot of the ground is ash or soot from when the volcano had erupted, and so there is a lot of sand all the way up, and you get little bursts of life in places. And then you're at the permanent glacier right at the top, where it's either frozen solid, 10 stories high of solid ice, or these very unusual patterns where, because of how high it is in the direct connection to the sun, you sort of get melting and freezing at different times of the day, making this treacherous. Because as we were walking along the path, I kept thinking, if I fall over, I could be impaled by one of these things. So it kept me upright as a safety measure. And so the idea is the hotter it is, the lower you are, and the colder it gets. And so these are just some images of what that top looks like from different perspectives. And at different times of the year, there may be more or less ice, but generally speaking, the amount of permanent ice is diminishing. When Al Gore first gave his inconvenient truth speech, he said, by 2020, there will be no ice. Now, there still is some ice, but it is diminishing. So this gives you a kind of sense for how high it actually is, where you're on the top and you see planes flying by at your level because they're starting to descend towards the airport in Tanzania. And so this is the most magnificent of the craters where the last volcanic eruption occurred. And so from different points of view at different times. And the idea is you've got many ways to get up there. There are 5-day, 6-day, 7-day excursions, and we chose the 7-day because the longer you take, the more likely your body will acclimatize to the altitude, and that increases your likelihood of success. So 7 days up along here, to the very top, and then 2 days down. And those 2 days, a lot of emotion there, because part of it is I need a shower. I need a shower really badly. I really want a shower, and boy, oh, do I need a shower. And the other part is it's over, and you're still processing what happened. You weren't sure if you were going to make it. You made it. Now, what does it all mean? A very overwhelming experience. And so a lot of fun getting to the top. We had an option after summiting here to sleep in here for the night, and the 4 of us decided we wouldn't, and we went down to a little lower because it's tough at that altitude. You really feel your heart and your lungs working overtime with that. We're here. We got to see a lot of the space. We've taken our pictures, but now I think it's time to go down. There are a few peaks there, and the highest one is where we went, Uhuru, where you see that sign. This is what happens at the highest levels when you're sick. They put you in a stretcher, and in the open areas, they'll put you in a device like this to try and run as fast as possible to get you down. And sometimes there are places where they're carrying them up to try and help the person if they've also sustained some kind of an injury. So a broken leg can be a real problem too. And here, it often was the case, we would step aside and people would be running at full speed, trying to get a person down so that they could be tended to. The most common kind of attention is oxygen. In fact, the group that we were with, the guide said, in the 10 years that they have been working together, they have never had a group that hasn't needed oxygen, and as luck would have it, neither of the 4 of us needed any oxygen to get up there, but that was just good fortune, I think. But it's very common at the side of the trail to see people pulled over just trying to kind of get their bearings and get some oxygen. And then when you get low enough, then the emergency helicopters can come in. And it's quite a thing when you see that, because it's a reminder of the dangers. The week before us, there was a German expedition of 4 climbers, and they got to the top, and they were celebrating at the top, and one of them opened a bottle of schnapps, poured the bottle, and they all toasted, and 3 of them died right there on the mountain. And for the guides, they say, while they know injury and death are a possibility, it's when you experience it also needlessly, because they're warned, that you just cannot drink at this altitude. You cannot drink with all the other medications you're taking, and yet people still do. So every night and every morning, detailed tests. And it's funny how quickly you get to know the strangers you're traveling with, because we talk in detail about what your group looks like. Was it brown, but sort of a dark brown? I mean, was it loose? How loose was it? There's this discussion because they are making decisions about what we eat, how far we go, where we sleep, and of course, if in fact we're cleared for the day. And so we get a little competitive in the beginning about our numbers. So, I had better numbers than my daughter for the first 3 days, but then she beat me, and that was annoying. And so between temperature, your chest and how clear it is, and that oximeter, we were always a little worried that we wouldn't be cleared for the next day's climb. So that's what it looks like when you haven't showered for days. And so we're gonna climb this thing, and that's what we did. And I can tell you at the last little bit, where there were about 100 yards, 100 meters to the top, it took over an hour. Each step was laborious. And you take a step and stop and catch your breath, and take another step and catch your breath. And we didn't have any communication. There was no talking. We just kind of looked forward, and we were determined. And the funny thing is, when we got to the top, all 4 of us, independently of one another, not looking at the other, and we all burst into tears. I never imagined that to be my reaction. I suspected, I'd be jumping up and down, but I started to cry, and I thought, oh boy. Here I am in front of my daughter and our friends. And I look around, she's crying, and the others are crying. Everyone was crying because partly we never knew if we were going to make it. We always worried each time, you sort of have a sore throat. Is that the beginning of something? Are we going to make it? There are so many things that can go wrong that it seems unlikely that you're going to somehow get through it. And the other part of it was I had nothing left. When we got to the top, I was finished. I was exhausted. And after 20 minutes, and that typically all you have at the top of that mountain after all those 7 days to get there. I turned to the other and said, wow, I have to walk now down? I mean, there's no gondola. I used everything I had to get here. How are we going to? Don't worry, just give us 2 hours. And so it was a different kind of walk. And I remember watching my daughter walk between these stalagmites, and one step at a time. And just before we had got to that final 100 yards, they pulled us aside and said, now listen, it is not uncommon to throw up. It doesn't mean you have altitude sickness, but there's a point at which your body is just at that point. And we didn't think much of it because we made it that far. And I remember watching her walk, and she just turned to the side. She threw up, sort of like the Exorcist did. And she turned back and just kept going. And it was one of those things where it reminded us of how delicate the balance of all of how you're feeling and the environment are. At one point, they took our backpacks off of us to make it even lighter, and it felt like they had relieved me of the weight of the earth when I had very little in the pack, and it was just enough to help me get through there. And at the top, after we started crying, we thought, well, we should take some pictures. And it was a real pleasure for me to hold the York University logo there, because none of these things in my mind were ever possibilities. Coming here was a chance to learn about things and the world around me beyond what my experience and my limited thinking about what was possible was. And a lot got me here, and it was a really proud moment. And the two of us really, I noticed that other two Americans didn't hold the American flag. I don't know why, but this was a really special accomplishment. So just some images of how that ice forms around that crater, where you see melting and freezing and melting and freezing, and what the shield of the glacier looks like. And although it is shrinking, it's still, you can see here's a climber here. This is over 10 stories high, and it was a real pleasure to watch him climb a sheer wall of ice from that rim, above the clouds. And this is what is shrinking because of climate change. And so that just gives you a sense for, you've got almost a volcanic ash here and a permanent glacier, and how this used to fill the whole of the plateau and the crater, and now it is shrinking back. And so we see in pictures, how much more covered it was, and how much less there is now. Now, sometimes when there's bad weather and lots of precipitation, it will fill up again with snow, but it's that permanent ice shield that we're talking about. But it really does give you a sense of how mammoth and how ancient all of this is around you. And this is the walk back, and these are the porters thinking about what they're going to do with all the money they earn. A laborer in Tanzania would earn about $3.50 a day, and the company that we took for this trek pays their porters $10 a day. And so what we saw was an incredible draw where many of these people were teachers and held other types of positions in the community, but they left to be porters because it was so much more lucrative. And of course, at the end, the tip is really what everyone is hoping for. And for many of them, this was going to make a big difference in their life. And so tourism meant a lot, and they were determined to keep that very healthy. So there we are at the end, at the congratulations zone, all four of us having made it. That's what I look like. Now, despite an enormous amount of sunscreen, an incredible burn from the wind at the top, the sun, which is much closer than it would be, and the reflection from off the glacier, and it had a really strong impact on all of us, but I was the only one willing to let a picture be taken for the record. So the point of all of this is to think about, all right, what do these things mean? What takeaways do we have? And, what does this specifically mean for me in terms of teaching? I've always been that guy who thinks about thinking, but also more so about doing, because I learn better when I do things. I can hear you telling me about it, but when I get to try it, somehow I learn better. And I'm now at the point where I can't imagine teaching without the sort of doing. I can't think of learning without doing. And so in all my classes, I try to incorporate this kind of notion of experiential education. In most cases, what we're often talking about are things like case studies and guest lectures and assignments. And here we're lucky enough to have practicums and internships where we go even further, where people get to work in the industry or in government, as it were, where they would be learning about the kind of work we were preparing them for. And so for me, it started with this idea of experiential education, give our students a chance to try something, and they'll learn better. And now it's moved to what I've been calling work-integrated learning, where we think about the work they will do, and we try to find ways to get the work into the curriculum. And then my thinking is that that prepares them better for the workplace. And so I talk about, a job-ready individual and what we can do to smooth the transition so that our students have an advantage. When they come into the workforce, they not only have the knowledge, they have the skills necessary to seamlessly transition into those roles. So I had an idea. I believed that this experiential education thing and work-integrated learning was more than just a kind of trendy thing, because many organizations go through these things where they talk about one thing and then a new thing comes along and they move in that direction. I think there's something more to it than just a trend. But here's where it got really interesting for me. When there is something that is exciting or stressful, I believe that it's more engaging. For a long time in teaching, when we say, our students are sitting back, they're not really engaged, say, well, be more entertained. And for a long time we talk about edutainment, get up there and do a song and a dance, and somehow that will, that's not learning. For me, it's when they're physically and mentally engaged. So what can we do to be so compelling that they don't tune out and they don't want to look at their phone? Now that's a tough thing to do. So I've been experimenting with increasing the kind of intensity of the experience to make it more compelling. And my thinking was that if we do this, it will have better results. And so there are two ways that I've done this. First is with a briefing note simulation exercise that I've developed, where people are supposed to work in a group and write a briefing note on a particular emerging crisis. To make it more interesting, every 5 minutes there's a new update, and so new information comes in, which simulates the world we live in, where things don't just stop when you've been given the assignment. And then they've got to come together under the pressure of a time clock on the screen, counting down in milliseconds, the very little time they have, the 20 minutes to complete their task. That already took the group to a place where it was more interesting than just a breakout assignment and get it done. Second one is with a budget simulation, where the idea was that students would have to come together and say, here's the business plan that a particular department has. You're the minister and you're the deputy minister. You've got to find a 12% cut. Now, 12% is a good number because you can't just sort of find it with efficiencies. You can't just say, 3% across the board cut and we'll find the savings. 12 means you have to make hard decisions. And so the minister has to talk about the politics of the cuts, and the deputy talks about the practicalities of these cuts at a simulated cabinet meeting. Now, those are the two projects that I have been working with as part of this experiment. And what did I do? Well, by focusing on these two things, I've tried to, over the last 10 years, accumulate a whole bunch of data about how these things went. So 25 times with each of them, 1,250 students, and I met with them afterwards to go through their feelings and their thoughts about the exercise that they were engaged in. And I was also taking into account my reflections. As I observed the room, what did I see? And I took notes about that. I have been playing with this, sort of, a little bit of a stressor, a little bit of intensity, a little more intensity, what happens and how do they reflect, and thinking about how that works. And so here's how it started. The first is the sort of regular delivery. Go away, do this briefing note assignment. There's a clock, and there is updates. Okay. Now, you have less time. So what was a 2-hour breakout, now you've got 20 minutes to finish. In the middle of your exercise, minister's just called, he's got to leave early, so now you've got less than the time you had. And then I bring in a guest speaker who was a minister to manage the exercise with me. And then the location. So instead of doing it here in a classroom, we did it on the floor of our City Hall. All of a sudden, that environment changes the intensity of the exercise. Recognition. We had prizes in a number of the instances to try and make them more competitive. And then we would rank. So talk about the final product and which one was better, literally ranking them, and then a prize. And sometimes the prize was the minister takes you for dinner and you sit in the government's side of the house for a question period. And all of those things were ways of trying to make that thing more interesting. My experience has been the more intense we make it, the more we build on positive excitement, positive stress, the more likely they're going to be engaged. I heard some really fun things, and I'm going to share the things that I heard. We had to win. We just had to win. You know, once there was winning, all of a sudden they wanted to win. Having a former finance minister manage the cabinet meeting, well, that was too real. We had to deliver. You know, it's okay if you disappoint your professor, but you couldn't disappoint a finance minister. The clock turning down, you know, counting down, all of a sudden changed the way they felt. And this was the one that made me the happiest. There's tons of fun. I felt like I was at the cabinet table. If they're having fun, if they're engaged, then that's really quite exciting. Can't believe we're on the floor, City Hall. It felt like we were doing, you know, what we were doing was real. So for me, increasing stressors was a big part of trying to engage. Now the dangerous thing about this is if we go too far, then that's bad stress, you know, and bad outcomes. And so finding a balance where it's encouraging and it's rewarding and it's fun, that's the kind of sweet spot. But really in the end, for me, it came down to this. How could we make them feel like the challenge ahead was very real and it was up to them to rise to the occasion? I climbed this mountain because it was a lifelong dream. It was far and away outside of my comfort zone. I wasn't sure I was going to make it. And my thinking now is that if there is not an opportunity or the possibility of failure, then we don't grow. A student in a class just the other day said, you know, I've never done this before. I said, that's why you're here. We are doing, you know, you wouldn't come to university if you knew all this stuff, right? We are here to do things that you don't know about and to try things that are going to make you uncomfortable. And so talking about being outside of the comfort zone, doing things where you might fail to see if you could grow. I mean, for me, part of that trip was walking the talk to show them that anything is possible, just the way when Ian Green talked about climbing in the Himalayas. You know, for me then, it became something that maybe I could do. And so I think if we have fun in teaching, they'll have fun in learning. And the way we get there will be different in each subject matter, but a big part of it is thinking about what will challenge them in ways that will both compel and engage, but also give them a chance to fail. And what we often talk about in my class is you only fail if you don't learn things, and this is the best place in the world to fail because we're here to learn from it and to support you on getting better and improving. And so this is the place to take those chances. And once they kind of gave up those inhibitions and they got into it because they wanted to succeed or they wanted to win or they wanted that lunch with the minister, all of a sudden now there was nothing else, no cell phone, no laptop, and they were learning. And so without the fear of failure, I don't think this trip would have been as exciting because there was a very real possibility that I couldn't make it. So it made me go to the gym and work out and eat better more and more intensely because I wanted to do something that was going to be difficult for me. And so I think if we think about the way we teach and think about the kinds of opportunities we have and we put those things together, we'll probably find ways to deliver different type of education in ways that our students will enjoy, that we'll enjoy, and will make everyone better off. And so Thank you for listening to this tape. You've all been very patient. Are there any questions? Yes.
So I like the way that you talked about how it's important to, I guess, make education a bit more fun. But I also recognize that I think the biggest challenge for that is it's a lot easier done if it's a smaller group of students. Like if you're teaching 30 students, then you can make it fun for 30 people. But then when you have like a lecture hall full of 1,000 people, it's inevitable that there's going to be people who are going to be on their laptop, going to be on their phone. And then the only way you can really get those people engaged is to like dilute the content to the point where even if you do get these people engaged, then it's kind of been unfair to the people who would have paid attention anyway. So it's kind of like there's a bigger trade-off when.
So I think you're right. The challenge in bigger lecture halls is certainly very different. Now, there are technologies that some will use. So clicker technologies is a way of getting people, or on like Kahoot and other things on your cell phone, so that there are things you can do there. To my mind, though, the lecture hall is also an opportunity to bring those war stories and those cases and experiences that people have to bring to light. But that's an hour. Hopefully, the tutorial is the place where, in a smaller setting, more of these kinds of things can be done. It's hard work, though, I must admit. It's not easy. It takes a lot of effort. In the early days, I never told anybody about taking my students off campus and going to City Hall or Queen's Park, because I knew if I did, they would say, well, you know, there's liability, and you can't do that. You know, there's going to be a problem. So I just kind of did it. And now the whole world's caught up and said, oh, this experiential education is really good. And now we have supports in place where we have liability insurance. We do the WSIB insurance with our practicum students, so while they're working in a department, they're covered. And there are wonderful supports now in place. But you're right, it's a lot of work. And sometimes it's difficult by design to make it engaging. But that's, you know, hopefully, in different parts of the experience in first year and second year, you're going to find there are moments where you find that. And then as you get to more senior years, hopefully more and more of your classes are like. Anything else? Yes.
Just following from what the last person who was speaking said, there's an interesting. I guess there's a little bit of there's another problem here in that you're talking about your experience climbing the mountain. Now, of course, it was risky and you didn't know if you'd succeed, but you elected to do it. It was your choice. And of course, it's different in upper level courses, but if you have got large lower level courses, a lot of the people in those courses may be taking electives. They may be thinking they're under a lot of pressure. You know, they are not taking this because they think they might fail. They want a guaranteed outcome, and they're not. I mean, I think it would, you know, with those kinds of students. And I'm not saying all students are like that. But there are a lot of them. They're not going to the element of risk is perhaps going to have some negative blowback, isn't it?
I guess for each student, that outcome will be different. So for one, it's, you know, am I going to pass this? And for others, am I going to get the A or the A+ that I really need or really want? I think we try to tap into their energy and their excitement. And because we're all passionate about our subject matter, if we can make them interested or at least expose to the best of our abilities, our passion for it, hopefully that will catch fire. I was son of immigrants, first to go to school in my family. I got here, I had no idea what I was going to do, but there was a professor in the class that just made me fall in love with material, and the rest is history. And so I think there's an opportunity for us all to rise to that challenge. Mm-hmm. But I have come to the conclusion that not every one of my students is as motivated and committed and determined as I am. I'm hopefully going to try to get them excited about things and work with them when they're ready to work. And that can't always win every single one, but definitely going to try. It is hard.
Oh,
it is hard.
Yeah. And it makes me, what you was just saying makes me think some years ago, I mean this is going back a few years, students would ask me, well, what do I have to get a very high mark, say an A or an A plus? And I would say, you've got to take some risks. And in the past, they would, you know, they'd look happy, they'd smile, you know, they'd walk off and they'd, you know, work on it. But now, if I haven't said anything like that for years, because when I say, you know, the last time I said that, I got very negative reactions. You know, it seems like there's a somewhat, I mean, like you say, all the students are different, but there's less of a, you know, there's less tolerance for risk, you know, risk in the classroom.
And despite that, I think we should take chances, both as a faculty and as students. I think that's when we're at our very best, and knowing what the boundaries are is important judgment. But I think when we do that, then we find out what we're made of and how far we can take ourselves. The one thing I've struggled with is students who have no motivation. And I think, well, you know, I'm here to teach, and I'm here to motivate as well. And how much can I do? And it's a part of, I think, our job to kind of get them to understand why all of this is important and what the potential is. We did a really interesting exercise just a little while ago in one of my classes. We did a cost-benefit analysis of the degree. And we looked at all the costs and all the benefits, and we calculated, you know, a $2.5 million return on the investment. So taking the degree or not taking the degree, that over the course of a 35-year career, you know, it had a financial benefit of. And all of a sudden, for some of them, they thought, okay, I get that. That's practical. That makes sense. You know, there's purpose here. So each will be motivated in different ways and at different times. You know, maybe they're not ready today, but you know, they'll come back tomorrow. But I'm constantly searching for new ways to try and make it work. And most of my inspirations come from the students. If you talk to them and you ask them about things, they're usually the source of great ideas. Yeah.
Peter, I'm rather sorry I came today because I was all set to try this myself. Now I'm not so sure.
The toilet, yeah.
Hearing about the rigors involved. But I was thinking about the concept of failure that you discussed. And in a way, this is a one-time thing. You can get yourself up for it. You can put all your energy into avoiding failure. But teaching, every time you do it, you know you want to do it better than the last time, and you've got a group of people that you would let down if you didn't, not just yourself, not getting to the top, but a group of people who are there depending on you. And I remember once, some years ago, saying to the York Board of Governors that nothing I've done in my life was tougher than good teaching, for that very reason. You couldn't afford to fail. And a couple of years ago, I met Christopher Plummer when he was performing in Barrymore in Toronto. He and I were more or less the same age, and I said, how do you do that? One-man play, 6 nights a week and twice on Saturday. How do you do that? He said, I say to myself when I go to center stage, I'm going to be even better than last night. Not just better, even better than last night. So I think that's when you brought this into the world of teaching. That's what it's all about. And I think it explains why do some of us, old people like me, keep teaching, and others can't wait to get out of it because it's the challenge of not failing.
Most definitely. I always think, and this is before the subway, I mean, what it took for my students to get here, you know, in the dead of winter, to commute to get here. I owe them this. I have to be today, this has got to be the best class or my best effort at a minimum. And that if it can be that, then we can all go away saying, you know, he gave it his all. And that will make the class as best as it can be. And it is a little bit of a contagious thing where if everyone is engaged, you're not engaged or you're negative, you start to realize you're the one left out. And, you know, more times than not, they're going to come along and join in for the ride. I think you're right. You just have to make every class, and every lecture, or every seminar, or whatever it is, the best it can be, and then try to think about how can you do that.
I think you kind of touched upon this yourself, but thank you for the talk. It was very inspiring. I just got to know you since last year, and I wish I was a public policy student who did the degree, and I wish I had more time to just get to know you as a person. And one of the reasons as to, I'm the sort of person that always lets fear get in the way of trying to accomplish something. So I just wanted to ask you, how are you able to overcome or diminish that fear in trying to achieve what you want to achieve?
The number one fear I've observed in our students is standing up in front of the class and making a presentation. And for me, the best way to take a lot of that fear away is to be really well prepared. And so the fear of failure meant that I worked harder and ate better and did all the things and thought about the equipment and made sure I was ready, because I wanted to diminish all of the kinds of things that were in my control, so minimize and mitigate those things to the greatest extent possible. Then I had to deal with the unknown. Will my body metabolize? That's something outside of my control. But we followed all their good instructions, so they had us on a feeding schedule. We were drinking water when they said drink water. And, you take the advice, and this is the idea of the class. The professors are here to support and give advice, and so with those two things come you being positioned as well as you can for that opportunity to shine. And if you don't, then it's okay, because you get advice about what didn't work so well and what could be better, and you do it again, and then you do it again, and that's a little snapshot over the course of 12 weeks and 4 years, and so I just say, don't let fear stand in the way of you achieving your goals and objectives, because all around you are people who have managed to get there, and so that should prove to you that it's very possible. Professor Bill.
Yes. One of the things that strikes me, Peter, from your presentation is that you're a better teacher because you learn something about yourself on your journey. And what I sometimes think is part of the challenge that we have for students is we assume that they're there as learners, but they also are teachers as well. I never go into a class where I don't come out feeling like I learned something new from my students and even about myself. And one of the things I've introduced in my public management course over the last couple of years is getting the students to work in groups to teach case studies. So they review a case study and they facilitate a learning process in the class. And in the process, in teaching, they become better learners. And they have a lot of fun. And I was saying that laughter lubricates learning. Because I think when you're having fun, you don't notice that it's work anymore. But your reflections really remind me of that notion. As we're learning, we're also preparing ourselves to be better teachers, because now you're teaching us what you learn.
And frankly, to take that just a little further, we're people, and people are in this shared experience, and we can all learn from each other. What I often learn is how they approach or think about the task at hand, and I think, wow, that's not what I intended at all. What can I do to get them there? Or, wow, this is a great benefit. I never anticipated we go here. This adds another layer of something that I wasn't even looking for, but look, it's here. And how did it happen? Most of the experiential education stuff that I'm so interested in comes from the work of a fellow named Cole, who talks about how reflection is such a big part of having the experience and thinking about it. And so I'm now doing it most intuitively, and I can tell you that journey was all about thinking about life and yourself, and and the inner fears I had about what if I can't do this, and what would that mean? And everyone who does these trips says, hardest thing I've ever done, changed me. And I thought, well, that's just cliche now, everybody says that, but boy, it was the hardest thing I've ever done, and it changed me in ways. Because I think I understand my students better now. Because mostly I haven't been afraid of failing, but it's probably because I've been doing things that I can do. And this was a thing that I wasn't sure I could do, and frankly was more than I thought I was capable of. Sure.
How does it work with teaching if you say you have to teach a fourth-year class, but there are prerequisites, say the third-year course, second-year course, and so you go to teach the fourth year, and you discover that the vast majority of your class does not even understand not just the third year, but not the second year prerequisite material. And the reason for that is that your colleagues, for maybe very good reasons, have dumbed it down to such an extent that you just don't have the basis to teach the fourth year stuff. And they have good reasons, because if they are too tough and they irritate their chairman or the dean, that can have serious consequences for, say, their tenure. What do you then do as a fourth year instructor?
I've had the great pleasure of teaching in graduate programs where many of the participants don't come from the discipline. So they were in engineering and now they're doing an MBA. So I'm teaching them about government. You know, how do I teach someone who's been an engineer and been trained as an engineer to think about how government works? And so a lot of what I've learned is that I've got to assume my class knows nothing, and I've got to take them to a place where they're then functional. So while I'd love to talk about the tactics of government relations for 12 weeks, the first 2 weeks are about what is government and how does it work. So I find I have to build it into the curriculum. Also, there have been a couple of cases where we started to notice that our practicum students and our internship students, as they were entering those placements, weren't so very well prepared. And we were starting to notice that they struggled, and that our clients, government supervisors, placement supervisors, they were disappointed. And so we ended up creating a whole course in professional skills and communication to focus on all of the things we used to assume that people knew, the common sense that is not so common, and to focus on those specific skills, ensuring success in transition to work, because it wasn't there. It wasn't in the curriculum. So it's worse when it's supposed to be in the curriculum and it never gets taught. But I find that between the diversity of learners, so international students, different demographics, even, I've got people in second career, so now they weren't a part of there are lots of reasons why people in my class don't have what they need, and so I've got to build it in somehow. And that means, you being very clever about how you jam even more into your curriculum. But I just don't see any other way around it. And then having curriculum mapping exercises where we periodically think about what we're teaching and what courses and what exercises and where there are overlaps and where there are gaps, because those, I think, are fatal flaws. Sometimes peer review is what's required when, every 5 or 7 years when outsiders come in to kind of look at your program. That may be the point at which we can kind of get the rationale and the impetus for doing the things we know we ought to do. But it is a very real problem.
Sir. Peter, I was really struck by a couple of things that you said and a few things that appeared on your slides. And one was that you said that your grades reflected the engagement with the students in those simulation exercises. So I was hoping that you could elaborate a bit on that. And the other thing I was struck is you identified that some people actually thought this was a negative experience. It wasn't necessarily a positive experience. And I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on what that really means in terms of either adjusting the simulation exercise so it isn't necessarily seen as a negative experience for some people, or is that inevitable regardless of what you do? Some people will never be able to have, say, a positive experience from any particular lesson or exercise that you do.
So great questions. I'll answer the last one first. In the beginning, I just tried my experiment on my students and wondered and collected data about how did it work. But now I've got a whole bunch of questions that I ask before we begin to determine the kinds of boundaries there are. So for example, I had one group that said, well, I don't know if I speak on behalf of all students, but I'm uncomfortable with ranking because it's a very public thing and I don't want to see my name here and that others might feel as though they didn't do as well. that's a very real and important thing to think about. What would the potential negative impact be of that? Many students are very uncomfortable with public feedback and criticism for the obvious reasons. So I thought a lot about that, and some of the questions I asked start to help me know where the boundaries are with these groups. But a big part of the impetus, again, if you think about work integrated learning and you think about core competencies related to the jobs, your boss is going to tell you if it's not good. They're not going to sort of beat around the bush or let you write it again. And if it's not delivered on time, the minister leaves the building, and a good note tomorrow is not of any use to anyone. And so if we think about what it is we want them to learn and we start to transition them to the why do we have why do you have a deadline that you don't move on? It's not because I'm tough or mean or anal or any of it's I'm trying to prepare you for what the expectation is in the workplace. And when I share that with students, then they start to realize, oh, I get it now. So that's the rationale. That's why. And frankly, often they're grateful because they say that's going to be the difference between me succeeding or failing. The first part of the question was
your grades
the
reflect
grades.
the engagement.
This has been a blessing and a curse, because if the point of your effort is to get your student to do the thing really well, then if you're successful, they're going to have really high grades. How is it possible that a class of 30 can all have an A? Normally we think of normal distributions, but in our professional skills and communications course, for example, we use a tripod and a video camera, and we will video the interview questions, preparing them for that competition. We do that first, then we watch it on camera, and we go through step by step. See, when you look down, that might suggest that you weren't telling the truth. You go through all, then now let's do it again. And now let's look at it again, and let's do it again. And by the third time, they're good at it. And so where they see value and purpose, they get it, and they'll say, I'm doing this because this is good for me, and I want this because I tried a job interview and I didn't get it, and I'm worried that I'm not going to get it, and so I know I need these skills. When they're having fun, then all of a sudden, they're going to throw everything they have at it. And so sometimes at the end of the school year, it requires a bit of explanation as to why grades in some courses are higher, because they're anomalous, and it's a different approach to teaching. It's not to weed them out or to kind of come up with a distribution. It's to get them to success. And if coaching and mentoring, feedback, and for example, in one course we've got more than 10 assignments. If feedback is given every week, then writing improves. If you have one assignment at the end, when you get the feedback, the course is over. Hopefully in the next year you take that with you, but if you're using 10 assignments, and they're getting the feedback before the next one, all of a sudden now, all the preconditions for success are there. So if they take that advice, they're going to do better. And so that's been my experience. And so sometimes it's a blessing because you see success, and other times now you've got to explain it. But the university's been very supportive of this approach, and I think they understand why we end up where we do. Sure.
There's an African proverb that says, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And it seems to me that part of your climbing story is about having a relationship with your daughter and with two people who were former strangers and bonding into a kind of team, and then having a supporting cast who were there to make sure that you got over the rough spots and get you there. It seems to me that's a great metaphor for just about anything to do with worthwhile public administration. And yet in our coursework, it's often resisted the notion that working in groups is actually good learning because I have to depend on somebody else for my grade. So how do you get past that notion? Do you tell this kind of a story about how it plays out in real life, or from the trenches, or having spent most of my career in public service, I know from personal experience, nothing worthwhile ever gets done by yourself. How many people climb Kilimanjaro by themselves?
I would not have made it without that group. Every single one of the 24 people in different ways made it possible. And that's why when we left them, there were a lot of emotions, because there is no way, from the cook to the fellow with the toilet, I mean, every aspect of all of that is the reason why we made it. And what I tried to leave them with was, this was not just, you know, I have a bucket list full of things that I want to do, and this was the latest adventure. I mean, this was a lifelong dream. This was as big as it gets for me, and they made it happen, and without them, we couldn't have done it. I mean, imagine if they don't purify the water carefully, properly, the kind of illness that we can have. We saw that a lot. Imagine the food, the sleeping conditions, I mean, all of the advice was key. And the important thing was to take it, to understand that, you know, as teachers, I mean, we're here to help you get along. Most of the time I find telling people the truth is really a great way to approach things. And so a big part of the first day of class is the rationale for why things are structured the way they are. Oftentimes a student will come and say, you know, I don't really like the group I'm in. I said, you know, I know how you feel, but I had to work for 3 years with people I didn't like either. And more it's this sort of horizontal kind of virtual thing where a team is put together and they've got to produce something, and the next day it's another team. And, you know, this is actually more important than the substance of what we're teaching. You know, it's these skills. And then they go away thinking, okay, at least it's not, you know, some random reason or punitive, or they're lazy, they don't want to grade 20 papers, they want to grade 5 papers, you know, so that they understand the motivation. And I find also reminding people along the way is a very useful thing too. And frankly, every once in a while, having an outsider validate what you're saying can be really useful, because they'll think, well, what does he know? He doesn't work for government, he's been out of it for so long, but a guest speaker comes in and talks about the importance of group work. All of a sudden, you know, it reinforces. There was a time where we just said what we said and they accepted it and didn't question it, and those days are long gone. And so I think we owe them an explanation. So peel back the layers of the rationale, the pedagogy, the curricular design, sort of demonstrate why it is the way it is. And at least they'll go away saying, fair enough, I get it, it's deliberate. May not like it still, but at least they know what it is and why it's that way.
So I wanted to comment on a few things. I've also known Professor Constantinou for a short period of time, although I'm only a couple of weeks into my talk with them. I've already kind of realized that the real life skills it gives you, instead of being in the classroom and just hearing maybe the same things that you've been doing for 3-4 years that you've been doing your degree. And I really admire the idea of experiential education, because like I just mentioned, it teaches you the real life skills, but also it puts you in like a different scenario that is vastly different from like the classroom experience. I really want to tie this idea to what someone else previously mentioned about like professors having to take risks and students having to take risks when they're learning. I think that could be a good thing or a bad thing. I feel like it could be a good thing on behalf of the students, because it might teach you to learn in a new way or to learn something better. But on behalf of professors, it might be a bad thing, because it might not have the same payoff. So I'll give 2 examples. The first is, I'm in a course currently, and where my professor was mentioning how to answer the questions for the midterm exam we had, she said that it was I think a 30% midterm, which is quite a bit. And she mentioned, well, each answer, and there was only 2, should be around 1.5 pages each. And I was absolutely like mind-boggled at that. I said, well, I'm a poli-sci major, and my whole degree I've learned that, you know, your answers for your test should be at least 5 pages. You got to give everything you know into that and fill it up with so much detail so that your professor understands how comprehensive your learning has been. And she mentioned, well, I'm trying to make sure you understand what I'm asking you. Why do you need to put all of this flowery language into there for no reason? Just tell me what you know, and then I can give you a good grade. Which was very different for me, but it was a risk that I think paid off. And I'm in another class where my professor
asked me and asked the class to do a social justice campaign project. And I like the idea of experiential education, but I do feel like, tying into what you mentioned before, is that it does need to start at a lower level, because if you have students who are learning in only one way up until their 4th year, and then 4th year you hit them, or even 3rd year you hit them with these new assignments that take them very out of their comfort zone, it's only going to be those students who have spent their last year being really confident, going to events like this, who have the courage to speak up in a class and say, I don't understand this, can you explain it to me in an easier way so I can do well, while everyone else is going to be too timid to do that. And then with that social justice campaign, because not many people understood it, no matter how many times the professor explained it in the same words, the class average for that assignment was very low, because it was something so new, even though it was an assignment that was trying to get us to understand and relate with material on a practical level, and on a concrete level, instead of on a theoretical level, which is what people really wanted to do because it's a social justice course. It was hard and didn't pay off in the end. So that was the commentary to me.
Thank you for the kind words and great examples. I think we have to spend some time thinking about what we teach and how we teach, and coordinating it with others so that that mapping occurs.
Yeah.
And realize there's probably a lot of different ways to get to each of these places, and that I find more and more having that little toolkit of things is really helpful. Because I walk into a class and all of a sudden everything I assume to be the case just isn't. It's different. There's a dynamic, there's a reality. Sometimes it's just the sheer numbers, sometimes it's the number of different demographics in the room, sometimes it's language issues, and all of a sudden what you were sort of thinking you might do doesn't make sense. And so having those tools to be able to adjust and truthfully, frankly, experiment. We talk about lawyers having, if you talk to a lawyer, she'll talk about her legal practice, or a doctor, her medical practice. I mean, we are practicing what we do. And the more experiences we get where we've been able to reflect on them, take away lessons, the more tools we have, so when some of the context changes, we can adjust. Sometimes you go in with a plan and a lot of my classes are at night. I walk in, and on that day, at that time of the semester, there's no energy in the room. They've worked 40 hours already that week. They've got 3 big assignments. Okay, so what I thought I was going to do, not going to work. And all of a sudden, we have to adjust. And so I think if we are engaged in the practice of reflection, and we attempt each time to make it the best it can possibly be, we're probably doing all that we can. And if we treat our students as important partners in the experience, then I think that's the optimal scenario. Excellent.
Peter, thank you so much for your presentation. I really love those slides, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity maybe to put them up on the website along with your video of your presentation. But I've got some additional information, and Ian, you might be interested in knowing that Angela Orbiva, at 86 years old, is the oldest person to have climbed Mount Kilimanjaro.
You're a youngster.
So there's hope for some of us in the room yet. And not to diminish anything in terms of people that climb Mount Kilimanjaro, I found that Carl Egloff in 2014 climbed Kilimanjaro and returned again in 6 hours and 42 minutes.
Yeah.
So there are records out there in terms of age and in terms of time it takes to climb it. He was a porter himself from South America, so he's obviously conditioned and knows how to climb mountains very quickly or hike very quickly.
Well, last year, a 7-year-old did it. The first time they allowed someone below the 10-year-old minimum.
Yes. I hope you gave all of those porters a really good tip. You gave us a number of really important insights in terms of teaching and learning, and your wonderful experience in terms of climbing Mount Kilimanjaro. So please join me in thanking Peter for his presentation.